Welcome back to the Code Wolf. We've got a ton of great stuff to talk about today. And no, you don't need to watch the previous videos in this series for this one to make sense. So in this video, we'll explore version 4.0 of DBChatPro, a free custom AI-powered tool that lets you query and analyze SQL databases using natural language. The app accomplishes this without giving the AI access to your data and without having to use a search or indexing service. The AI simply understands the schema of the database and uses that to generate queries based on your prompts, which are then run by the app. Now, version 4.0 of DBChat Pro is 100% about expanding which AI platforms and databases are supported right out of the box. So originally, this app was designed to connect to Azure OpenAI and SQL Server databases by default, and it of course still supports that scenario. So now in version 4.0, we also have support for regular OpenAI, meaning OpenAI outside of Azure directly from the OpenAI company, as well as support for local Ollama models. On the database side, we also now have support for MySQL and Postgres, again without any custom dev. I've also redesigned the app with a connector structure that makes it easier to add additional types of SQL databases by implementing an interface. More on that later. So first, we'll step through a guided tour of the app and see how it all works, with some glimpses at the code along the way to make sense of the flow and structure. Then we'll see how you can get set up to use the app and these new features yourself. Towards the end of the video, we'll dive deeper into the code for those who are interested in learning more about how the app works and how to extend its functionality for scenarios that are still unsupported. Let's get started. The channel is just crossing the 6,000 subscriber mark at the time of this recording, so I want to say a huge thank you to everyone for your continued support. If you haven't already, please consider supporting the channel by subscribing, becoming a member, or just hitting that like button. I also want to give a special thanks to the latest Delta Wolf member, CyberIQ AI LLC. Your support means a lot, and thanks to all the other members and super thanks contributors. Okay, so let's start with a demo of how this latest version works and highlight all of these new compatibility features. And along the way, this will also be an introduction to onboard you if you've never used this app before. So we'll kind of work our way backwards towards how to set this up after we look at the demo. And then after that, we'll dive a little bit deeper into the code if you're interested in that part. So when we first run the app, it'll just say you haven't connected to a database yet. Visit the connection page to set up a connection. So we'll head over there. And now on this manage database connections here, this is where you enter a name and a connection string, and it'll save that so that the app can connect to that database to run SQL queries. But in version 4, we now have this new field. And if we click on this, there's now 3 different database options. So previously this option wasn't here because the only supported database out of the box was Microsoft SQL Server. You could add other database types by tweaking the code, but now everything's been refactored to where it just kind of supports this out of the box. So for example, let's select PostgreSQL, and in the source code that we'll look at in a minute, there's this sample connection strings file, and this gives a few different sample connection strings for these different database technologies, and these connect to some common sample databases that are out there. So for example, the SQL Server one connects to AdventureWorks, so I have that running in a local SQL Server instance on my computer. You can get this off of Google. It's a pretty common SQL Server sample database. And for the other two, we're using a database called Sakila, which is a sample database out there for a few different technologies. So we have these running in a container, one for Postgres and one for MySQL here. And to start those, you'll just need Docker Desktop installed. I'm not really going to go through all of that in this video, but you would just say Docker run and specify the port to expose and pull down that Postgres image, and that'll create those locally to connect to, and they'll wire up to the sample connection strings in the source code. And for MySQL, you would just change the port and change to the MySQL image. So that's an easy way to get sample databases up and running for Postgres and MySQL if you're looking for that. So back in our app, let's say we want to save this PostgreSQL, and I'll call this Postgres test. And then let's grab our Postgres connection string. So this will connect to that container that I just showed. And so let's say check connection. And that's going to go out and read the schema of the database so we can kind of take a look at that and make sure everything looks accurate, which it does. So this is a film and actor sample database. So I'll save that and that'll pop up here to our existing connections. Now let's select MySQL and call this MySQL test and grab our MySQL connection string here and check that connection again. This is the same film database, but it's running on MySQL in a different container. So we'll save that. So now we've got two. And finally, let's pull in our SQL Server database. So I'll call this SQL Server test. And this one is just going to wire up to the Adventure database. So we'll check connections. This all looks good. It's a different schema. You can browse the tables here to make sure everything came through, and then hit save. So now we have three different connections, and these are all from a different database technology. So now if we go back to our dashboard, you can see that our UI has changed a little bit if you're familiar with the previous versions of this. So the biggest change is that up here, we now have three options when authoring a prompt to the database. We now select the database itself. So there's the three connections that we just created. And I'm going to stick with this Postgres test for now. And you can see the schema for that popped in over here on the right. So you can kind of use this to browse what's in the database as you think of what prompt you want to write. But the other two big features here are that we can now select the AI platform and the AI model. And so if we click on this, now we have Azure OpenAI, regular OpenAI, and Ollama, so the local Ollama models. And so I'm going to choose Ollama. And so here we enter in the AI model. So this app is flexible enough that you can just bring whatever model you want to use. And so, for example, I have the new 5.4 model here. So I'm just going to type that in. And this is loose text because there's a lot of models out there. So just whatever your model name is, put that in there. And so now let's say something like, get me a list of film categories. So I saw that was a table down here. And we're actually going to land in a breakpoint that I set in our app. And you can see we're in the Postgres database connector. So the app is smart enough to figure out which database connector it needs to go out to the database and get the data. So our AI generated a query that happened earlier in the app. And you can see that query is up here if we mouse over that. And so now it's going to loop through and run that query on our Postgres database. So I'll click continue. And sure enough, out in our UI, there's our same database table that we've always had, but now it's being pulled locally using the 5.4 model. This is a big update. So we have different categories here. So we have drama, family, foreign films, and so on. So I could say something like, get me a list of the films that are in the drama category or something like that. And I'll submit that. And that's going to go out to our AI and generate a query. And sure enough, it lands back in our Postgres database connector to run that query. And there's our list of films. And if we try and find our film category name, you can see they're all in the drama category over on the right. Now, if you're new to this app, you can look at the SQL that it generated and ran against our database. So here's the AI generated query. Then our app took that query and ran it against the database. Remember, the AI is not hooked up to the database directly. And there's some insights here about what the AI did to author that query. So this is great. This is working locally. But we can also switch out to a different model or a different database. So maybe we want to query our SQL Server database. And notice that as soon as I pick that, the schema over here switches to our AdventureWorks database, so we can tell that that changed properly. And now let's switch our platform to OpenAI. And I have an OpenAI account configured with this, and I'll show you how to do that in a second. You just have to plug in your key. And so I'll say GPT-4o. So this is going to go out to OpenAI now. So this database has a different schema. So let's say something like, get me the top 5 products or something like that. So we have this product table over here. And I'll hit submit. And it's going to think for a second. It's going to go out to OpenAI and get our query. And you'll see we hit our breakpoint. But this time we're in our SQL Server database connector, not our Postgres connector. So it's going to go out to our SQL database, AdventureWorks, and sure enough, there's 5 products for us. So we can kind of seamlessly switch between different databases and different platforms here. And one thing I want to point out is that I received a lot of requests for different models. So if we switch over to our MySQL database, we get our actor and we get our actor schema back over here. We can switch to Ollama. And so, for example, another popular model is the Llama 3 model. So I was using 5.4 before, but now we can say something like, get a list of customers, and I'll say submit. And then we go to our MySQL database connector, which is new. So I'll click continue, and there we have it. We have some customers coming back, and we're using the Llama 3 model. So for example, if I go out to our terminal here, we can say Ollama, and this gives us a list of the commands we can run to see different things. So I'll say Ollama list. And so these are all the different models that are on my computer now with Ollama. So we just used Llama 3, and earlier we were using 5.4, but any of these models can now be used with the app, whether or not they're a good fit for this. For this type of work, you're going to want a model that excels at sort of analysis or code generation and reason, so kind of a technical focus like that. But it's interesting to kind of experiment with different models, and they all produce sort of different mileage. I would say honestly that the OpenAI cloud models for this type of work do handle more sophisticated queries better than the local models usually, but 5.4 and Llama 3 have produced some pretty good results for me, so go ahead and play around with those. Okay, so let's see how to get this app set up and running on your local computer. It's super easy. You just pull down the app and then there's just one step and then you're off to the races. So the first thing you'll need to do is head out to GitHub at this code repository. I'll include this link in the description, but this is the source code for the app. And then you'll just want to clone this down. So you can either copy this clone URL and use Git to pull that down, or you can download it as a zip. And once you have that on your computer, the folder should look something like this. It's kind of small and hard to see. But if you're using Visual Studio, you'll just double click on this SLN file. And if you're using VS Code, you can, of course, just open this whole folder. So I'm going to open this in Visual Studio, and I already have that here. And this is what the app looks like when it comes in. Now, to get this working, all you have to do is open up this appsettings.development.json. And so in here, there's just three things potentially that you'll want to configure, and that depends on which AI services you want to connect to. So first, there's the Azure OpenAI endpoint, the Ollama endpoint, and the OpenAI key. So if you want to connect to Azure, you'll have to plug in a URL to an Azure service, and Ollama usually uses this standard port by default, so localhost and then this port. And then OpenAI actually doesn't have an endpoint, it just uses your key to figure out where to go. So just as an example, let's say that we only want to use our Azure endpoint and our Ollama endpoint, but we don't want to connect to OpenAI, or maybe we don't have a key for that. So I'll delete that, leave that blank. This just determines the maximum number of rows that will be displayed in the UI with our paging grid view there. So if you want to expand or reduce that, there's an option for that now. So we have our Azure and Ollama endpoint set, and from here, all we have to do is run the app, and let's see how this works. So our app launches as expected, and this is kind of where we were at the start of our demo. So we just go over to our connections page, and let's choose a MySQL connection, and I'll call this MySQL test or something like that. And then back in our source code, we can get the connection string to our container if you have that running. And so we'll plug that in, and sure enough, now we can connect, and we can save that. Now, when we head back over to our main dashboard page, you'll see this time we only have Azure OpenAI and Ollama available. We don't have regular OpenAI available, and that's because we left that option blank here. So just whatever AI service you fill in here, that's what will appear in the UI. Okay, so let's wrap up by discussing a little bit more about the code and how this app actually works with all these new updates and such. So in the UI, when you submit this prompt, it's basically a two-stage process. The first step is it takes your prompt and it sends that out to the AI along with the database schema, and it says, get me a SQL query for this prompt. And then part two is that it takes that SQL query that comes back and it runs it against the appropriate database. So over in our code, we can see this. So this get AI SQL query, that's the method that runs to send the prompt out to the AI. So you can see it's passing in the user prompt. And so this method just pieces together this big prompt to send it. So it says, you're a cheerful database assistant. Then it writes out the database schema for the selected database. And then it gives it some instructions about how to build out the SQL query. Now, probably the most important part of this, though, is the create chat client method up here. And if we click down to that, this is the method that generates an AI client for whatever AI platform you selected. So for example, if it's Azure OpenAI, we get that client, or an OpenAI client, and so on, based on the AI service that you selected. And it also passes in the model to the AI so it knows which one to use. Now, the reason we're able to use any one of these clients, so if you notice, it always just returns whatever client it creates. The reason we can return any of these is because they all implement this iChat client interface. And this is from the Microsoft.extensions.ai libraries. And those are designed to create sort of these abstractions over common AI tasks. So this iChat client, this defines certain methods like complete async and such that send a prompt to the AI and they abstract away common tasks. And that lets you change out the underlying client that's actually connecting to the AI. So all of these just implement that iChat client interface, and that's why we can return any one of them. And that also means we could add other platforms here. Now, with Microsoft Extensions AI, these are kind of the three most common that are currently supported. There's one or two others that I didn't bother implementing here, but you can also write your own. So if you implement iChat client with a different AI service, such as Google's Gemini or maybe something from Amazon, you could add support for those, but you'll have to implement your own iChat client interface because those aren't currently available yet. But as more are added, you'll be able to just add support for more platforms. So right now, these are the three that are supported just because those are the three that are supported by this Microsoft Extensions AI library. And we're using that library because it provides that abstraction where we can kind of swap out any one of these clients, whatever selected. Now, unfortunately, this is also kind of the one part of the app I'm really not happy with. In an ideal world, you would want to inject these clients using dependency injection and maybe dynamically inject different ones depending on the app requirements. But with the way the extensions AI libraries work, I haven't found a way where you can kind of dynamically change which AI model it's configured with, because once you create it and add it to the dependency and container, it's just kind of configured to use that model. And so in order to keep this really dynamic where you can pick kind of any client and any model, I'm just sort of manually creating these right now, but this is an area I'd like to dig into more and see if there's a more elegant way of doing this, because this is not really how you would want to create clients like this right now, but for this demo app, I'm just kind of leaving it this way, and maybe I'll dig into that later. So this AI service is what picks which AI client talks to our AI model or service. So that's kind of the first of the two steps that we talked about. For the second step, we have this database management service. And this selects which database connector should be used to either generate the data table, so to run the SQL query from the AI and create the table that gets displayed in our UI. And then there's also this generate schema method. So this is what analyzes the database to bring back the tables and columns. So basically we have these three connectors. So there's a MySQL connector, a Postgres connector, and a SQL Server connector. And all of these implement the iDatabase service. And so if we collapse this, all three of these have a method to generate the schema. So this will go out and analyze the tables and columns. And then we have the get data table method, which runs the SQL query that comes back from the AI. So for SQL Server, it's using SQL connection. For Postgres, for example, it's using the NPG SQL data source, so from that NuGet package. But regardless, all three of these connectors return the same structure, and that allows us to kind of seamlessly swap out different connectors. So right now we have these three, just like we had three different AI services. And what's great about this iDatabase interface is that if you wanted to add another connector, so for example, if you wanted an Oracle connector or some other SQL relational database, you would just have to implement this service in a new class and then register it for dependency injection like we do here. And then that connector will be available to the app. Now you will have to do a couple other things. So in this management service, you'll have to add a new case. So maybe an Oracle case, and then use your custom connector there, and then update those UI dropdowns to be able to select those. But basically, you can add support for any type of relational database as long as you create the connector and update the UI for that. These were the three most commonly requested, so I've kind of provided them right out of the box. So hopefully you can see how this app could be further expanded on both of those two parts. So part one of getting our SQL query from the AI service, we just need a iChat client interface for whatever type of AI we're trying to work with. And then on the database level on part two, we just build a different database connectors. So the app has been redesigned to use kind of these abstractions at both of those layers so we can plug in different clients or different connectors for whatever we're trying to do. So I hope this helps, and I hope you experiment with this app and see what you can do with it. Leave a comment with your thoughts. Please consider subscribing or supporting the channel somehow, and I'll see you next time. Thanks again.